Here come the Yanks.
So welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Battlefield House for the Battle of Stoney Creek. Today's battle is going to be representing the American withdrawal back to Fort George. After the Battle of Stoney Creek, though the Americans had inflicted heavier casualties on the British, their command had been shaken up by the capture of their two commanding generals, as well as a lot of the men were worried that the British position was a lot stronger than they had previously thought. So after some conferring, the officers decided that they were going to withdraw back to the 40-mile creek. Along the way, though, the British spied an opportunity and were quick to harass and attack the Americans as they went along, preventing them from really organizing themselves and setting up a new defensive position. So coming out onto the field now, you've got some regular American soldiers, and behind them you'll see a group of soldiers who all have green hat bands. This is a unit that would be formed in July of 1813 by a man by the name of Joseph Wilcox. Now, some of you good Canadians don't know his name, and you should. Joseph Wilcox is the biggest traitor in Canadian history. He actually was a member of the Legislative House when he accepted the rank of Major in the United States Army, and he raised a force of Canadians to fight alongside the American invaders. He believed that the British suspension of habeas corpus and the way that they had treated the subjects of Canada, he felt that it was rather high-handed and a bit tyrannical. They looked at the Americans to restore the freedom and liberty they believed belonged in Canada. About 153 would fight in the Canadian Volunteers, and they had a lot to fight for because there were standing orders that if they were captured, they were to be taken to Ancaster, where they would be tried for treason. And 8 men actually were sentenced for treason and had it carried out, in which they were hung, drawn, and quartered for their treason. Joseph Wilcox actually was to be executed on the spot if captured. So now the British are pushing on. They're threatening the American light troops. Now, light troops are expected not to fight those big, long lines. They're expected to crouch down and kind of pick at the enemy. The muskets are not terribly accurate. Most of them could barely hit anything at 100 yards. So the idea was with the light troops, it was to harass the enemy, it was to try to break down their cohesion, and also act as a tripwire for your own forces to make sure you don't stumble into the enemy or they into you. And the British are giving you excellent examples of volleys there. Volleys were necessary to deal with the problems of the flintlock musket. Flintlock muskets tend to be rather unreliable, with as much as a 1 in 5 misfire rate. And as I mentioned, at 100 yards, good luck hitting anything. But if you had like 20 or 30 men all pull the trigger at the same time and in the same direction, there were a few working muskets, and a few of them were going to hit something, even as far as 200 yards. So now the Americans are firing back in turn. Now, one of the common questions we get is when people see that the Americans are wearing gray coats, they say, well, didn't they wear blue? Well, they wanted to. But unfortunately, in 1812, they lost a large portion of their blue dye supply. That is the natural thing that's going to happen when you declare war on the blue dye supplier. So by 1813, shortages forced many of the troops to wear kind of stopgap uniforms. So there's record of men wearing white uniforms, green, brown, and even gray. The gray work coats will become famous in 1814. The gray-coated Americans at the Battle of Chippewa did something no army had done since 1747. They took on British regulars on an open battlefield in equal numbers and defeated them. This was a shock to the British and became a pivotal moment in the formation of a regular United States Army. So the British are coming on, colors flying. The colors that you see there are the King's colors and the regimental colors. The King's colors being the large Union flag, and the regimental colors being the jack there, the green flag with the Union flag in the corner. The regimental flags were very important to the morale of a regiment. They would usually have battle honors painted onto them. There would be all sorts of symbols of the regiment. It was really the heart and soul of the regiment itself. It was considered a point of honor to be able to carry and defend the flags in battle. And if you lost them, it was shameful. men would fight to the death and beyond to try to protect those colors. Including one incident in Spain where the French tried to capture a set of British colors, and where they demanded from the 15-year-old officer who was carrying the flag that he surrender it, and he refused. So they attacked him, and he had his one arm chopped off. He received several saber wounds, including 2 to his head, and he was stabbed by a lance 7 times. He survived, and he never gave up the colors. He actually tore them from the staff and hid them under his body to try to keep them out of the French soldiers' hands. Now, with the nice wind here, it's hard to see just how thick the smoke really gets. And you can see from just a few muskets that big cloud. On a battlefield where there are several hundred troops blasting away at one another as fast as they can, which for a good point doesn't take a minute. Good soldiers can load these weapons in about 12 to 15 seconds. But with that much gunpowder going off, that much smoke, one of the biggest problems was identification. So if you wanted to make sure you're only going to get shot at by one side, the best idea was to make sure your side is wearing the most bright and distinctive thing you could be wearing. So for the British, that's red. So with the British in red and the Americans in blue, it should be easy for them to identify each other even in the thick smoke. Most accounts state the first time you could see and identify your opponent was about 20 paces away. There's one record from the Battle of Lundy's Lane where they were about 15 feet apart and could not even see one another in the smoke. Now some of you are hearing the musicians playing out there, and today it seems almost weird to bring musicians out to the battlefield. But 200 years ago, the musicians had a very important role in that they were the walkie-talkies of the army. Regiments would bring up the musicians and use them to communicate up and down the lines. With the fife, in particular, being very handy. That nice little high-pitched squealing is high enough that it can be heard over the rumbling din of cannon and musketry. As the battle is raging on, pay close attention. You'll see some very fine-looking gentlemen in both armies. These are the officers of the British and the American forces. In this time period, officers in the British and the American armies were much wealthier than the average infantryman, and the simple fact of the matter is you had to be. Being an officer was extremely expensive. You were expected to purchase your own uniform, weapons, equipment, pretty much everything. In fact, in the British Army, you even had to buy your rank. And the starting rank for Major Ensign would cost you about £400 in 1810. That today would be about $30,000 to $50,000 just to get in. Begs the question, if you got money, why on earth are you spending it to get shot at? And the main reason is, if you can do well as an officer, you will become very rich and famous on your own. Young British officers were often rewarded with land, titles, promotions, and could become very rich and powerful. An excellent example would be Arthur Wellesley, who had ended his career as Lord Duke of Wellington, probably one of the most decorated soldiers in British history. His wealth today would exceed £40 billion, and he had 5 mansions and estates by the time he left the military, so not bad. In the American Army, though, your position didn't translate to you becoming the Duke of Boston. Instead, it translated to you running and maybe becoming the mayor of Boston. There are hundreds of American officers who, after the War of 1812, ran for political office and would achieve up to and including the presidency of the United States. Men like William Henry Harrison and Andrew Jackson are great examples of this. So you can hear from the woods some of the First Nation allies giving their war cries. Now today we are all fully aware of what the average Iroquois person looks like, or the average First Nation person. They're a human being like you or I. But if you're a young man growing up in Boston in 1805, you've never seen what a native warrior looks like. But you know what they look like because of all the newspaper stories. The newspapers would tell you that they were about 7 feet tall, You knew that they were about 350 pounds of solid muscle, that they had big long claws, they had glowing eyes, sharpened teeth, they tend to eat raw hearts right out of the chest, and they'd rip all your hair off right when you died. That, of course, is not true. They're human beings like you or I. But if that's what you believe, just hearing the war cry, something that gets all these thoughts in your head, they can be absolutely terrifying. Be it not for the First Nations, today you would be standing in the United States, not Canada.
Justin would die.
So during the retreat in 1813, the Americans were constantly being harassed by the British, not only on foot, but also on sea. The Royal Navy forces on Lake Ontario were constantly bombarding the Americans and dropping off small forces to attack them. The Americans, as a result, had to pick up their pace to get back to Fort George. They would leave many pieces of equipment, from tents to muskets, equipment, food, all this stuff abandoned in haste to get back to Fort George. They were concerned that with the naval control and the troops pressing against them, the British would be able to land troops behind them, surround them, and crush them. After the Americans were pushed back to Fort George in 1813, they didn't really venture too far out from there for the remainder of the campaign, making Stoney Creek the high water mark of the American invasions. They never got past here. Throughout 1814, though, fighting would rage on in the Niagara region, constant skirmishing back and forth in a no-man's land around Niagara and the Lake, including the Battle of Beaver Dams, where a young woman by the name of Laura Secord walked 19 miles off the road to the Great Black Swamp and up the escarpment to warn the British of an impending American attack. Her warning allowed the British and their First Nation allies to bag over 500 Americans captured to a force of about 60 British regulars and about 450 Native allies. As winter began to set in, the Americans slowly were losing their troops in the Niagara. They're being transferred out to other areas because they viewed the Niagara as too strong. Eventually, they would be forced to abandon the Niagara area when they had less than 200 men to defend it. And this is when the Canadian volunteers really become nasty, because when they abandoned Niagara on the Lake in 1813 in December, they set fire to the village, burning it to the ground and giving most people only a couple hours warning before doing so. Their actions would earn them eternal hatred from the Canadian and British forces and would lead to a lot of them sometimes being treated rather poorly if the enemy got a hold of them. For some of the eagle-eyed folks, if you're looking in the British line, you notice there's a few of these soldiers there that aren't armed with muskets or swords. They've got really big, long spears. These are sergeants' pikes. Sergeants in the British Army carried these long pikes as a mark of their station, but they could also be very handy in other ways. You could use them to steady up your men, using them like a pole on their back to push them along. They're very good for keeping horses at bay. They can be very handy in any sort of fight. They've also got a nice rounded end at the base, which is a very good soldier adjuster. So if you got somebody who's causing trouble, that end's going to make sure that won't happen twice.
Your bodies are fighting.
Yeah.
Now you can see the musicians doing their other very important role out on the battlefield, and that's evacuating the wounded and the dying. Sometimes in the battles, the dead and the dying would start to clog up those formations, and so it's the responsibility of the musicians to get them out of the way. If there's a lull, they would also bring them all the way back to the medical tents, but usually if you were wounded, it was up to you to find your way back to the medical help. Surgeons would usually come out onto the battlefield to assist, Surgeons in this time period were very different from surgeons today. They usually learned their trade the same way a plumber would through apprenticeship, and the most common surgical procedure was going to be amputation, which a well-trained surgeon should be able to do in about 12 to 15 minutes.
Catch it this time.
Now there's one more unique uniform I haven't pointed out here. In the British lines, you'll notice there's one guy who's wearing a very green uniform. He has 4 big red stripes on his arm. You in there is representing a soldier of the 60th Regiment of Foot, the Royal Americans. And like all good Americans, it's made up of Germans. The Royal Americans was originally a German regiment that was raised in the British Army to fight in the Americas. They thought the Germans, with their hunting skills, would be excellent for fighting in the brush. And that tradition carried on, with the 60th, many of them being armed with rifled muskets, allowing them to accurately aim and hit an enemy at about 200 yards away. It's interesting to note just how international the British Army was. In this time period, if you took 5 British soldiers, 2 of them would be from either Scotland, Wales, or Ireland. 1 would be from England, and the other 2 would not have been from the British Isles. One regiment that served, the Regiment de Watteville, was a Swiss regiment that actually had 15 languages spoken by the men in the regiment. It's even noted that there was a company made up of men who were described in the time as Mohammedan, so Muslim troops in the British Army. So with the American rear guard getting pushed off the battlefield, the battle slowly coming to a close. There's a few little volleys to give the Americans a tap on the rear end and send them on their way.
The helping shot.
Here we go. Washington and
The thin red line.
Now this particular formation, as the British are moving forward, you notice a lot of them are carrying their muskets across their chest. This is not the way you want to see them coming at you, because usually when they do that, they'd have bayonets fixed, because the next step is to lower those bayonets and run at you full speed. The bayonet was an extremely deadly weapon, and extremely fearful. One officer saying it was fear of the bayonet that did more than the bayonet ever would. And so with that, the British cheer their victory, so feel free to cheer with them if you'd like. And as the battle comes to a close, we must always remember that this is a battlefield. The men who died were buried in mass graves in and around the battlefield together. They didn't care whether they were British, American, Canadian, First Nation. Usually they were all buried together, and they all entered into the afterlife together in that sense. And so we like to pay homage to these brave fellows who fought and died here, no matter where they came from. And our typical way of doing that is with a lament played by the fifes and drum. So out of respect for those who fought and died, we ask that you observe silence during the playing of the lament. If you want to doff your cap, that's even nicer.
If the Americans want to Gonna come down like Sullivan Beach.
Screwed up the band.